story in the book. Look at number 4, because this is fascinating. It took forever to get a grand jury to indict Casper and Sea Dog, the big dogs of the bank robberies, because what had they done? Nothing. They didn't rob any banks. They were just sitting in a car down the street. All the FBI had was the testimony of terrified teenagers who skipped school between lunch and recess. And here's what was happening. These guys did not personally rob the banks. They went to high schools. They recruited kids. They gave them semi-automatic weapons. They said, walk into the bank lobby and shoot it up into the ceiling. Get the money, get out, bring it to the car. We'll give you a little bit. They had no idea how poorly they were being paid because they were getting more than they ever thought they could. So how do you prosecute people who never actually robbed the bank? That was a difficulty. So that's an intriguing story. Look at number 7. This is actually a bank robber from long ago, Willie Sutton. Sutton was famous. He dated starlets. He made not one but 2 daring escapes from prison. He was once asked, why do you rob banks? And he replied, because that's where the money is. Later, he would deny having said that, but it didn't matter. To this day, his quip is known as Sutton's Law, and it is used to instruct medical students on the importance of considering the likeliest diagnosis first. The likeliest diagnosis first. And so I find that fascinating that that is this person who had this lasting impact and spread it. All right, now look at number 8. There are so many specific illustrations of his principles in this book. Here's one. Where you live determines the kind of practices made by the medical doctors. And so number 8, how many times a doctor visits a patient in the last 2 years of their life? The national average in 2019 is around 54 visits in the last 2 years of someone's life. In Minneapolis, by contrast, the average is much lower, 36. But do you know what it is in Los Angeles? It's 105. You get 3 times more doctor visits in your dying days in LA than you do in Minneapolis. Why? Because doctors take on the practices of the doctors around them. I'm going to tell you a story in a few minutes about the opioid crisis that is breathtaking. Okay, so look at number 12. We've heard that there is a movement against vaccines, and yes, that may be picking up steam, but this is a fascinating quote, number 12. It's actually very small pockets of people within the state, such as the parents who sent their children to a very specific brand of elementary school who have a vaccine problem. I'll tell you in a few minutes what that school is. Actually, I'll tell you now. Turn to page 3, number 17. What Waldorf, these are the Waldorf schools, does for you is it definitely gives you total curiosity about the world. There's kind of this Waldorf effect of being so eager to learn and curious about everything instead of it being mashed down and packed into boxes. The thing with Waldorf is they teach you how to learn. And so, look at number 18. The final word in a video comes from Sarah going to Waldorf, she says, gives you a little bit of a superhero complex. Then she winks. That's the only danger of sending your kid there. Well, what the book says is that Waldorf parents do not give vaccines to their children at the rate that the rest of the country does, and that feeds the vaccination hesitancy. Why not? Because they want kids in the Waldorf schools to figure things out for themselves. And as a result, they kind of reject expertise, including medical expertise. Okay. Look at number 20. Canada, and it might help to remember that Malcolm Gladwell is Canadian, has national health insurance, not a bewildering network of private insurers. In 2022, the United States spent 17.3% of its GDP on health care. In Canada, the equivalent number was 12.2%, about a third lower. We end up, forget the current debate on treatment that is withheld, we end up doing more that is not as effective as Canada. But by the way, the life expectancy is every bit as good in Canada as it is in the United States. All right, number 23, communities have their own stories, and those stories are contagious. Now, if you look, I put check marks by bold quotes and quotes in big font, and I'm not going to be able to read all of them with the time we have. So I'm going to start skipping, but you might want to put a check mark on your printed copy next to the bold quotes and the big font quotes. But look at number 32 on page 4. Miami is the central point of Medicare fraud. There's more Medicare fraud in Miami than anywhere else by far. Not by a little, but by far. All right. Number 32, I put the question to Miami Mayor Maurice Ferré. In the same way that Boston came to grips with the huge Irish influx of the 1870s, he replied. And how was that? They didn't. They didn't. Miami didn't absorb 3 seismic events and continue on as before. Miami became a different place. Circle that phrase. When you have tipping points, it can permanently change a city and a community. All right, number 38, if epidemics are influenced by the overstories created by the inhabitants of a community, then in what sense are communities responsible for the fevers and contagions that plague them? Turn to page 5. At the top of the page, circle this phrase, number 43, a monoculture, where everybody is the same, a monoculture. A monoculture, on the other hand, offers no internal defenses against an outside threat. Once the infection is inside the walls, there is nothing to stop it. Now, I think it's useful to remember the origin of the concept of tipping point. Gladwell did not coin the phrase. He popularized it in the same way that in the book Outliers, he popularized a principle that he named the 10,000 hour rule, but he didn't come up with it. A guy named Anders Ericsson or Erics Anderson, always get them mixed up. He wrote a book called Peak. He is the original researcher that brought about the pieces of the 10,000 hour rule. So look at number 48. This captures the essence of the birth of a tipping point. It was about a neighborhood that shifted. In the 1960s, 60,000 white people fled Atlanta, which at the time had a population of 300,000. That's 20% gone. And the book reminds us, as the book The Tipping Point first mentioned, that when a neighborhood is predominantly white and a black family moves in, everything's fine. But then when you reach a certain percentage, close to a third, when you reach a certain percentage back in the 60s of black families moving into a neighborhood, the white people fled the neighborhood. Thus, tipping point and white flight. All right, number 50. I want to explore the ways in which tipping points can be deliberately engineered. Miami and Poplar Grove are places, I'll be talking about them, that unintentionally opened the door to an epidemic. I'm talking here about taking things one step further, intentionally orchestrating the course of contagious behavior. All right, on number 53, circle number 53. I think we can go one step further. I think we can call the magic third a universal law. We're going to come back to that in a minute. All right. Look at page 6, number 57. For those who were shocked by the idea of opening up of white communities to Negroes on a quota basis. Now, let me comment on the word Negro. He's referring back to a neighborhood that used that word in California, where when the neighborhood was set up, there was planners of that neighborhood that said, this many houses will be owned by white people, this many houses will be owned by black people. And it kind of worked for a long time. So for those of you who are shocked by the idea of opening up white communities to black people on a quota basis, I can only ask, what solution do you propose? So that's fascinating. All right. Number 62, Rosabeth Moss Cantor. Let me pause. Mike Mowry is a raving loyal fan of Rosabeth Moss Cantor. She has written significant books on her own, and this magic third principle in this book is giving credit to the research of Rosabeth Moss Cantor. So, number 62, Cantor believed that skewed proportions were a problem. Put a star beside this. This may be the most instantly transferable principle for you to use in your teams, in your city government. So this is really worth paying attention to. She wanted to increase the numbers of the minority group to the point where they could be themselves and exert full influence over the culture of the group. A person named Lowell, by contrast, was interested in keeping the minority group below that tipping point. He wanted to engineer the admissions process so that Jews, this is an actual story out of Harvard decades ago, stayed on the low end of a skewed distribution. Let in too many Jews, and the Jews drive away the Gentiles. Lowell was essentially saying that he was trying to prevent white flight. He taught his successors a lesson they have never forgotten. He showed them how to control Harvard's group proportions. So remember this concept of group proportions. We're going to come back to it in a few minutes. Now, put a star beside 64. I'm not going to read it, but I want to tell you the story. Harvard has more sports teams in more sports than any other American university. I did not know this. By the way, Malcolm Gladwell has a particular disdain, he admits this, for elite universities. And what Harvard has done is they let athletes in that have lower test scores, lower grades, and these are generally white athletes. And the surest way to get into Harvard if you're white and not a genius is if you excel at a sport. And so tennis is one. They started a women's rugby team. Nobody watches the games, but they have it. And he writes about this. All right. It costs, get ready for this, somewhere around $100,000 a year in tennis coaching, tennis lessons, trips to tournaments to produce a top level tennis player in today's culture. Now, I know something about this from the past. I was ranked number 5 in Texas my senior year in high school in tennis. I was good. I was not great. I was good. I got a college scholarship, not to Harvard. I once played, this is my favorite memory, I once played a singles match at the HEB Tennis Center, Howard Butt Tennis Center in Corpus Christi, against Howard Butt III. I lost. He was a great guy. But Howard Butt III had unlimited resources, including his own tennis center, to get great at tennis. I was a poor guy who, I won't tell you the things I did to scrape by in my tennis career. So that's an interesting story. Okay, turn to page 7, number 75. There were a couple of TV guys who decided to give the green light to a TV series. Let me read it. He was famous for saying that half of the American viewing audience were morons. When pressed on his estimate, Klein doubled down and suggested that maybe they were all morons. He was known for promoting what he called the least objectionable programming theory, or LOP, which held that a television show's success was a function of how few people it offended. Klein also coined the term jiggly to describe the overly sexualized content of his competitor, ABC. These were not men with principled ideological agendas. They were people who understood the American zeitgeist. And what did they do? They produced a TV show and they called it Holocaust. And I'm an old guy and I remember watching it. It was a miniseries, kind of like Roots was. Roots changed America's thinking. So does Holocaust. So did Holocaust. Page 8, number 76. The Holocaust survivor and activist Elie Wiesel, writing in the New York Times, called NBC's Holocaust untrue, offensive, cheap, and an insult to those who perished and to those who survived. In a way, he was right. It was television's version of history. But Wiesel missed the point. This was the first time most Americans had ever heard of the Holocaust. Now, let me comment that before this TV series, the word Holocaust had not been adopted. People, they didn't deny it. They didn't know about it. Germany, after that TV series, changed its laws and got rid of the statute of limitations. The TV show Holocaust started a social epidemic. There were no museums in America named Holocaust museums. None until after that series aired. That's breathtaking. And then number 82 on the OxyContin story. Between 2007 and 2016, the number of doctor visits by OxyContin sales reps goes up by nearly a factor of 5. And that's not to every doctor in Tennessee. That 5-fold increase was directed at the, circle this word, super spreaders. The OxyContin epidemic was caused by a handful of doctors, relatively. All right, turn to page 9. These are the thesis quotes. The second one, that's the revenge of the tipping point. the very same tools we use to build a better world can also be used against us. And then the quote in larger font: if the world can be moved by just the slightest push, then the person who knows where and when to push has real power. So, who are those people? What are their intentions? What techniques are they using? In the world of law enforcement, the word forensic refers to an investigation of the origins and scope of a criminal act, reasons, culprits, consequences. Revenge of the Tipping Point is an attempt to do a forensic investigation of social epidemics. Social epidemics. Turn to page 10. I've got 7 minutes, so we're going to fly through this. Top of the page, after remembering that Gladwell is an author and a thinker and a great writer, about the phrase tipping point. According to a person named Grodzins, the changeover happened slowly at first. By the way, anything in italics is also directly from the book here. Then gathered steam, and then at a critical juncture exploded. As he wrote, using a phrase that would thereafter enter the American vernacular, this tip point varies from city to city, from neighborhood to neighborhood, but for the vast majority of white Americans, a tip point exists. Once it is exceeded, remember this is a quote from that person, they will no longer stay among Negro neighbors. A tip point, Grodzins said that he heard the phrase from realtors who wanted to move white homeowners out of urban neighborhoods. The tip point was a threshold, and it was around the magic third, 1/3 of the people. All right. Revisiting the book, The Tipping Point, How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference. Look at the second bullet point. The tipping point grew like the epidemics it described, the book. It grew like the epidemics it described, at first gradually, and then all in a rush. Bill Clinton referred to it as, quote, that book everyone has been talking about. That's a great line. So, bottom bullet point of that section. 25 years ago in The Tipping Point, I was fascinated by the idea that in social epidemics, little things could make a big difference. The law of the few, the power of context, the stickiness factor. When I was a boy, this is how old I am, 7-Eleven introduced the ICEE, I-C-E-E. It was later renamed Slurpee. And I remember I was in junior high, and you could drive legally at 14 in Texas at my age, and there were a handful of people that owned their own cars in the 8th grade. And you could see them driving around town in their car holding a 7-Eleven ICEE. In one fell swoop, every kid in Harlingen, Texas wanted to go to the 7-Eleven and get an ICEE. So a handful of people started the epidemic. I just find that fascinating. All right, next major bullet point: overstories, super spreaders, and the rise of social engineering. So the first is the overstory. The overstory casts a shadow over whatever is happening on the ground. And then the second element is group proportions. The mix of people in a group determines when and if that group tips. And so overstory comes from a biological realm of a forest, and there's an overgrowth over everything below. Here are some of the stories. I've already talked about the bank robbers in Los Angeles. Huge number of bank robberies all at once. in one city. Wasn't happening in New York, Chicago, Dallas. It was in Los Angeles. So where something tips really matters. The surgeons who perform more surgeries and more tests. There were two towns together. It's this first bullet point. In Stowe, 70% of the kids had their tonsils out by the time they were 15 years old, as opposed to only 20% in Waterbury, right next to them. So where you practice medicine, you practice it the way it's done in your community. You have more tonsils taken out in one city than another. There was no difference in the need to take out tonsils, but the doctors had different practices. How your doctor treats you, in many cases, has less to do with where your doctor was trained or how well he or she did in medical school or what kind of personality your doctor has than where your doctor lives. That's fascinating. There was a dramatic change about a radial treatment in cardiology. And if you look here carefully, when the rest of the country was doing 10% radial, we were doing 70% radial. Molitor's answer is that the Boulder cardiologist turns into a Buffalo cardiologist when a doctor moved from one city to the other and changed the number of radial treatments he was providing. Fascinating. The Waldorf schools have fewer vaccinated students, and the Miami money launderer, and you might remember that there is a former governor and current senator in Florida who he was the CEO of a company that was guilty of massive Medicare fraud. And that's because it was based in Miami. So look at the top of page 11. There are three basic things you need to commit healthcare fraud. You need you need patients, you need medical professionals, you need files so they can falsify records. One of the disturbing stories in the book is a fictional name of a real place. Gladwell knows the place, but when it was written up in an academic journal, the authors used the fictional name, and Gladwell has not revealed where this is. But it's a place called Poplar Grove. That's its fictional name. And in the interview that Malcolm Gladwell gave in Dallas, he said, I walked around Highland Park, which is a really wealthy neighborhood, and he said Poplar Grove is dramatically wealthier than Highland Park, which is beyond my comprehension. And so what happened was every student was the same. Mike, it's 11:40. I need 2 more minutes. Every student was the same, and it had a much higher rate of suicide. Well, I don't have time to read the rest of these stories, but I do want to read the bottom quote in bold. This is about the Holocaust. Do we think the American public is finally ready to hear about the Holocaust? And Klein's response, the TV guy, said, I think they are. The result of that was a miniseries called Holocaust, the story of the family Weiss. It was originally going to be just called the story of the family Weiss, and they decided to go with the word Holocaust, which was the critical factor. Much of it was filmed at the site of the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, and a guilt-stricken veterans threatened suicide. A former SS officer reported that his wife and 4 children called him an old Nazi after watching the second installment and deserted him. That's the power of that TV thing. All right, turn to page 12. You've got the acceptance of same-sex marriages. You've got serious things about the opioid crisis. And the opioid crisis, there was a doctor in one state who said, we got to fill out 3 forms in triplicate to prescribe medicine. And the states that adopted that had lower opioid crisis than the states that did not follow that. Okay. Back on the bottom, Rosabeth Moss Cantor. Look at the top of page 13. This is the magic third. If you have a team of 9 people, you don't want 1 woman and 8 men. You don't want 2 women and 7 men. You want at least 3 women and 6 men. Look at this quote right here. The magic seems to occur when 3 or more women serve on a board together out of 9 people. The magic third. 1 person was lonely, felt lonely. 2 felt like a friendship. 3 felt like a team. So women can finally use their leadership muscles when you've got a group of them. On the right, 5 lessons and takeaways. Sometimes the simple explanation is not adequate. We have to probe deeper. Number 2, some problems never get fully solved. Number 3, there are a lot of bad people out there. Don't be one of them. Number 4, some bad actions may not be intentional, but intentional or not, they can cause real harm. And number 5, maybe we need to work on developing deeper empathy. And then 3 implications for businesses and organizations. Number 1, businesses need to be attentive to ethical issues. Number 2, businesses need to avoid tokenism. Include the magic third in your leadership teams. Don't have 1 woman or 1 Black person or 1 this kind of person. You need to have the magic third. And number 3, 1 person can become a key, the key. Look for ways to identify and fully utilize the power of those who can create tipping points of progress. Revenge of the tipping point, over stories, super spreaders, and the rise of social engineering. And Mike, yes, I went too long, and I apologize to you and everyone. Back to you, Mike.
No apology needed, my friend. Fascinating and excellent synopsis. And, this is one I have been waiting to read. And then I decided, well, I'm going to wait till Randy does the synopsis and then I'm going to read it. And man, you really whetted my appetite. So thank you so much. Krissa, I'm curious, any takeaways from you? I mean, Malcolm Gladwell get your head spinning around so much, but any initial takeaways that you want to share?
I'm glad you asked, Mike, because I kept thinking about the tipping point and servant leadership and kind of what we've seen over the years when it comes to servant leadership and cities adopting those principles and the change that it's making and how it has those ripple effects. And so that's kind of where my mind went. And then, of course, there were so many elements and aspects and quotes that really directly applied to servant leadership as well. And it really, this is my shameless plug, got me really excited, even more excited to see Randy's presentation at the Servant Leadership Conference in January.
Yes, no kidding. I hope everybody is signed up for it. If you haven't, there's still time, both virtual and in person. And we will hope to see you there January 30th and 31st at the Hilton Lakes Resort in Grapevine, Texas, greatest city in the world. And we want you to come. It'd be great. Here's the thing I thought about it too is, thinking about HR in cities, how important this issue is that Rosabeth Moss Cantor has talked about, that you can't just have one person that's a diversity or 2. You've got to have a bigger subset. And I think that's really important. We otherwise, as she says, you can't see you. You can't see you as you. And I love that. We need everybody's voice. And we continue to be committed to that at SGR and helping you in any way we can succeed and be more successful as cities. So, Randy, thank you so much.
Mike, Beth Goodale has a hand up. I don't know if we've got time to ask if she has a question.
Okay, I didn't see that question. Okay. You got some takeaways. Okay. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you, Beth. It's going to actually to the top of my reading list, and I'll probably be reading it during the holidays. And I think I'll be like Randy. I'll probably sail through it because it's going to be hard to put down. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and we will be taking a break from webinars for the rest of 2024. We start again January 8th with Randy Mayeux, second Wednesday of the month, and he'll be doing a new book for executive book briefings. I hope you have a great rest of the day, rest of the week, and a wonderful Christmas time. And if we don't talk to you before, we'll see you down the road.